Just days after surviving a coup attempt, the nation's revolutionary leader, Ibrahim Traoré, has signed a significant new gold mining deal.
The story of this gold rush doesn't begin where you might think. It didn't begin with savvy international investors calculating returns from distant gleaming vaults. Nor did it start with the frantic dance of global markets where digital numbers dictate the value of a nation's earth. The high-stakes game would come later. No, the real story started far from the trading floors. It began on the ground with a bold declaration of sovereignty, a nation daring to seize back its gold, and with it, its future and its destiny. It began not with a bang, but with the rustle of paper and the steady, unwavering voice of a state broadcaster. For weeks, the air in Ouagadougou had been thick with a nervous energy, a sense of a great wheel turning. The young captain, Ibrahim Traoré, who had taken the helm of the nation, had promised change. Not reform, not adjustment, but a fundamental reset of the nation's destiny. But few could have predicted the sheer audacity of what was to come. The world was watching, but it was looking for signs of political consolidation, for diplomatic overtures. They were not prepared for an economic declaration of war. The announcement came, swift and decisive. A presidential decree, read out on national television and radio, its language stripped of all ambiguity. Effective immediately, the state of Burkina Faso was assuming full and total control of all major gold mining operations within its sovereign territory. The contracts, many of which were signed decades ago under opaque circumstances and which funneled the vast majority of profits overseas, were declared null and void in the name of national interest and security. For a moment, there was a collective, stunned silence across the nation. Then, the meaning began to sink in. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a seizure, a reclamation. What followed was a masterclass in coordinated action, a 7-day revolution, executed with military precision. In just 7 days, Burkina Faso seized control of its gold mines. The operation, codenamed Operation Sovereignty, unfolded at dawn on the first day. Convoys of the Burkinabe army, not in aggressive postures, but as guarantors of a state decision, moved to secure the perimeters of sprawling mining sites that had, for years, operated as de facto foreign enclaves. There was no violence, no dramatic standoff. Instead, there was the quiet, unshakable authority of a state reclaiming its own. State administrators, economists, and engineers, many of them trained abroad but who had returned with a patriotic fire, arrived with official documents. They were not there to argue, but to implement. They presented the foreign management with the decree. They were informed that their operational authority was terminated. They could cooperate with the transition, or they could leave. The choice was theirs, but the outcome was not. Foreign giants who had extracted wealth for decades found themselves powerless. Companies from Canada, Australia, and Europe, whose logos were emblazoned on the very machinery that dug into Burkinabe soil, were caught completely off guard. For years, they had navigated the corridors of power, securing favorable terms, enjoying tax holidays, and operating with minimal oversight. Their annual reports spoke of tons of gold, of shareholder value, of market dominance. But those reports rarely detailed the reality on the ground. The environmental degradation, the displacement of local communities, the paltry royalties paid to the state, a pittance compared to the billions of dollars in bullion flown out of the country each year. Suddenly, their powerful lawyers, their lobbyists, their back channels to Western governments meant nothing. They were faced with a simple, unbreachable fact. The soldiers at the gate were not taking their calls. Their executives, accustomed to being received with deference, were now being handed notices of termination by Burkinabe civil servants. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been inverted. And at the center of this storm stood one man. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't ask permission. He did not travel to Paris, London, or Washington to plead his case. He did not seek the approval of the World Bank or the IMF. In a series of addresses to the nation, his voice calm but resolute, he laid out the doctrine of the new Burkina Faso. "Our resources," he declared, "are the inheritance of our people, not the property of foreign corporations. For too long, we have watched our gold enrich others while our people suffer. For too long, we have been told that this is the only way, that we are too poor, too weak to manage our own destiny. Today, we say no more. He framed the seizure not as an act of aggression, but as an act of survival, a necessary step to fund the nation's desperate fight against terrorism and to build a future where Burkina Faso children would have schools, hospitals, and hope. He was betting his government and his country's future on this single defiant move. He declared liberation, and the people answered with a joyous roar of celebration. The initial shock gave way to an outpouring of national pride that flooded the streets of Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, and even the smallest villages. It was a spontaneous festival of sovereignty. People danced in the streets, waving the red and green flag of Burkina Faso, its golden star seeming to shine brighter than ever before. Motorbikes, draped in national colors, weaved through the jubilant crowds. Elders, who remembered the promises of independence decades earlier, wept openly, seeing in this act a fulfillment of a long-deferred dream. Young people, who had grown up with a sense of hopelessness, saw a future they could finally believe in. This was more than just about gold. It was about dignity. It was the casting off of a psychological yoke, the assertion that they were masters in their own house. The shockwaves of this 7-day revolution radiated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across the Sahel, other nations watched and learned. In neighboring Mali and Niger, where military governments had also recently come to power on waves of anti-French and anti-imperialist sentiment, leaders took careful note. They too presided over nations rich in resources but crippled by poverty and insecurity. They too had long-standing grievances with the post-colonial economic order. The move by Traoré was not just an inspiration, it was a blueprint. It demonstrated that a determined African nation could, in fact, defy the international system and survive. Phone lines between Ouagadougou, Bamako and Niamey buzzed with conversations. Delegations were quietly dispatched. A new alliance, forged in shared struggle and a common vision for sovereignty, was beginning to crystallize. The old powers were losing their grip, and a new Sahel, led by a new generation of leaders, was starting to imagine a different future. The international media screamed of chaos, of risk, of a dangerous precedent. Western governments issued stern warnings, threatening sanctions and isolation. But inside Burkina Faso, the sound that mattered was not the clamor of foreign condemnation, but the steady hum of machinery in the mines, now working for a new master. It was the sound of celebration in the streets, the sound of a new national anthem being sung with renewed fervor. A new chapter was being written, not by foreign pens in distant boardrooms, but by the Burkina Faso people themselves. The wealth of the land would now, finally, serve the people of the land. The vault was closed. A new era had begun. It begins with the earth, a deep, resonant red, rich with the memory of millennia. And within that earth, a secret, a glint of yellow, gold. For centuries, this metal has been an object of desire, a measure of wealth, a catalyst for conquest. But to understand the revolution unfolding in Burkina Faso, you must first understand that this was never just about gold. This was about something far more precious, something that cannot be weighed or traded on any stock exchange. This was about dignity. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked upon the vast mineral wealth being systematically siphoned from his homeland, he didn't just see a loss of revenue. He saw a wound, a deep psychic wound inflicted over generations. He saw the bent backs of his ancestors, toiling under a foreign lash for a pittance. He saw the hollowed-out promises of independence, where the political masters changed, but the economic chains remained. Dignity, for him, was not an abstract concept. It was the right of a Burkina Faso father to feed his family from the richness of his own soil. It was the right of a mother to see her child educated, healthy, and free. It was the right of a nation to stand on the world stage, not as a beggar with a bowl, but as a sovereign equal, master of its own house and its own destiny. To grasp the magnitude of this act, we must rewind the tape of history. For too long, Africa's wealth had enriched distant capitals, building empires on the foundations of its resources. The story is etched in the faded ink of colonial maps, where European men drew arbitrary lines across a continent they barely understood, carving up cultures and communities with the stroke of a pen. Their primary interest was not governance, but extraction. Ghost ships sailed from African shores, their hulls heavy with gold, diamonds, rubber and cocoa, bound for London, Paris, and Brussels. They left behind a continent scarred by exploitation, its development deliberately stunted, its people taught to believe their resources were not truly their own. The era of formal colonialism ended, but the system it created proved stubbornly resilient. A new, more insidious form of control emerged: neo-colonialism. The exploitation now wore the mask of international finance, of multinational corporations, of unfair trade agreements signed by compromised leaders. The gold still flowed out, but now the process was sanitized, legitimized by complex legal contracts and the cold logic of the global market. The profits built skyscrapers in distant financial districts and funded lifestyles of unimaginable luxury, while the communities living atop the very mines that produced this wealth often lacked clean water, basic healthcare, and reliable electricity. It was a paradox of staggering injustice. A continent of immense wealth, home to some of the world's poorest people. This was the historical debt that Traoré's government sought to settle. And so, the decree was made. A seismic shift in the nation's trajectory. The gold would stay home. This was more than a policy announcement. It was a declaration of economic independence, a reclaiming of the future. Suddenly, the abstract promise of national wealth became a tangible plan for national survival and prosperity. Now, every ounce would serve Burkinabe children, Burkinabe dreams. And what are those dreams? They are not fantasies of opulence, but visions of fundamental justice. The dream of a classroom in every village, filled with books that tell the story of Burkina Faso, of Africa, taught by teachers who are paid a living wage. The dream of clinics where medicine is available, where a child's fever is not a death sentence, where new life is welcomed into the world with safety and care. The dream of roads that connect people to people, markets to farms, not just mines to ports. It is the dream of food sovereignty, of using the nation's own resources to ensure that no citizen ever goes hungry again. It is the dream of a nation powered by its own energy, its industries driven by its own ingenuity, its culture flourishing with renewed pride. Each gram of gold, once a symbol of foreign plunder, was now transmuted into a brick for a new school, a dose of vaccine, a seed for the next harvest, a foundation stone for a new, self-reliant Burkina Faso. The shockwaves of this decision did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. The message echoed across the continent, traveling on the airwaves, through encrypted messages, and in the bustling markets from Dakar to Nairobi. In the Sahel, where nations like Mali and Niger were engaged in their own parallel struggles against foreign influence and insecurity, it was a thunderclap of validation. Here was a brother nation, not just speaking the language of sovereignty, but acting upon it with audacious courage. The spirit of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's martyred revolutionary leader, who had once declared, "He who feeds you, controls you," was suddenly, powerfully resurrected. This was the modern-day echo of the great Pan-Africanist dream, the vision of Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, and Sékou Touré. A vision of a continent united, free from external domination, and in control of its own vast resources. Young people across Africa, connected by social media and a shared frustration with the post-colonial status quo, saw in Traoré's actions a blueprint for their own futures. The message was clear, unambiguous, and aimed squarely at the global powers who had for so long dictated the terms. It was a continental declaration that the era of paternalism was over. The time for supplication had passed. Sovereignty is not negotiable. The reaction from the world's financial centers was immediate and predictable. On the chaotic floors of Western stock exchanges, a tremor of anxiety. Red numbers cascaded down screens as traders and analysts scrambled to calculate the risk. It wasn't about the volume of gold from a single West African nation. It was about the terrifying power of the precedent. What if Nigeria decided to reclaim its oil? What if the Congo took full control of its cobalt? The entire edifice of global resource extraction, which had guaranteed cheap raw materials for centuries, suddenly seemed fragile. The fear was not of a single domino falling, but of a chain reaction of economic liberation that could redraw the world map of power. But back in Ouagadougou, the mood was not one of fear, but of pure, unadulterated joy. The gold was coming home. In cinematic scenes, bars of pure bullion were carefully counted, catalogued, and secured in the national reserves. This wasn't an abstract figure on a spreadsheet in a Swiss bank. This was tangible wealth, physically present under Burkinabe lock and key. Its weight was the weight of their future. Out on the streets, the people erupted in celebration. Crowds draped in the national colors, their faces painted with gold, danced with an energy that was both joyous and defiant. This was the catharsis of a people taking back their story. This was not a move made in isolation by a military junta. Wide shots showed Captain Traoré surrounded not just by his armed forces, but by a sea of civilian supporters, a powerful visual testament to the unity of purpose between the government and the people. From a satellite's cold, impartial view, one could imagine a new light switching on in the heart of West Africa. A small nation, long relegated to the margins, was suddenly glowing brighter, a beacon of sovereign will. And on a windswept plateau, at the very site of a newly nationalized mine, a group of workers, their faces etched with the toil of their labor but illuminated with pride, raised the flag of Burkina Faso. As it unfurled against the sky, it was a symbol of a promise finally kept, a declaration that the land and all the riches within it, finally, truly, belonged to its people. They said Africa's gold belonged to others. It was a story told for centuries, whispered in the halls of power in London, Paris, and Brussels, and shouted from the trading floors of New York and Zurich. A narrative etched into the very contracts that governed the extraction of wealth from African soil. They drew lines on maps, installed compliant leaders, and engineered economies designed for a single purpose: to funnel the continent's vast riches outwards. For generations, the story held true. The glitter of gold, mined from the deep earth by African hands, would never be seen by the children playing in the villages that surrounded the mines. It would vanish into the vaults of foreign banks, its value reflected not in new schools or hospitals for the people, but in the soaring stock prices of multinational corporations. The arrangement was presented as a complex, immutable law of global economics, a reality to which one must simply resign. The gold was theirs, by right of capital, by right of history, by right of a system they themselves had built. They said sovereignty was impossible. This was the second, more insidious chapter of the story. They warned that any nation daring to claim its own resources would face immediate and overwhelming consequences. They spoke of capital flight, of crippling sanctions, of being locked out of the global financial system. They would point to the ghosts of the past as cautionary tales. The ghost of Patrice Lumumba, who dreamed of a Congo for the Congolese. The ghost of Thomas Sankara, right here in Burkina Faso, who dared to rename his country the land of upright people, and was extinguished for his vision of self-sufficiency. Their memories were weaponized, used to instill a deep-seated fear that true independence was a fatal ambition. The message was clear: accept your place in the established order or be erased from the board. Sovereignty, they argued, was a luxury Africa could not afford, a dangerous fantasy that would lead only to chaos and ruin. They painted a picture of benevolent partnership while holding the keys to the continent's economic prison. But in the quiet corridors of Ouagadougou, a different story was being written. A decision was made, not with the roar of cannons, but with the determined stroke of a pen. The whispers of the past, of Sankara's dream, had become a roar in the hearts of a new generation. They understood that the economic prison had invisible bars, and the only key was the very wealth being stolen from them. A plan was forged, audacious and precise, to be executed with the speed of a lightning strike. A 7-day countdown began, not to war, but to liberation. The world, consumed by its own dramas, was oblivious. The corporate executives and foreign diplomats slept soundly, confident in the permanence of their system. They had forgotten a fundamental truth. The most powerful force in history is not greed, but a people's collective will to be free. And so, history began to bend. On the first day, a team of Burkina Faso's sharpest legal minds was assembled in secret. For 48 hours, fueled by coffee and a burning sense of purpose, they worked. They didn't just amend the old colonial-era mining code, they tore it up. Page by page, they drafted a new economic charter, a declaration of resource sovereignty. Every clause was a hammer blow against the old order. It mandated that all gold mined in the country must first be refined on its soil. It established a new, non-negotiable state share in all mining operations. It created a national gold reserve to be held in Ouagadougou, not Geneva. It was a legal masterpiece, designed to be unassailable, a fortress built of words. On the third and fourth days, the plan moved from paper to the physical world. In a series of coordinated silent movements, units of the Burkinabe military and state security fanned out across the country. There was no violence, no dramatic confrontation. They arrived at the foreign-operated mines not as aggressors, but as the quiet, firm embodiment of the state's authority. They secured the perimeters, took control of the export logistics, and ensured that not a single ounce of unrefined gold would leave the nation's borders. They were not seizing property. They were enforcing a new reality. The message to the mine operators was simple and delivered with unwavering calm. The old rules no longer apply. A new dawn has arrived. By the 5th day, the world woke up. The news broke like a thunderclap across the financial capitals. Panic erupted on trading floors. Stock prices of the mining giants plummeted. In corporate boardrooms, emergency meetings were convened. The air was thick with disbelief and fury. How could this happen? The response was swift and predictable. A chorus of condemnation rose from Western governments. They spoke of breaches of international law, of reckless expropriation, of endangering foreign investment. Threats were made, both public and private. Ambassadors were summoned. The international media machine roared to life, painting Captain Traoré as a dangerous radical, a dictator leading his country to disaster. But in Ouagadougou, there was a profound and resolute calm. The storm was expected. It was the sound of a dying empire raging against the light. On the 6th day, Captain Ibrahim Traoré addressed his people, and by extension, the entire African continent. His speech was not a fiery tirade, but a clear, powerful lesson in economics and dignity. He laid out the decades of exploitation in stark numbers, showing the vast chasm between the wealth extracted and the poverty that remained. He explained that this was not an act of theft, but the end of a theft that had lasted for over a century. He called it a fight for survival, for the future of their children. His words resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across Africa, leaders and citizens watched, holding their breath. They saw not a reckless gamble, but a courageous first step. Phone lines lit up between presidential palaces. Messages of solidarity, at first cautious, then bold, began to flow in. Burkina Faso was no longer standing alone. It was standing as the vanguard of a continent awakening. Then came the 7th day, the final declaration. With the nation and the world watching, the new mining law was officially promulgated. Captain Traoré sat at a simple wooden desk and with a steady hand signed the document into law. The ink was barely dry when the official decree was transmitted to every embassy, every international news agency, every corporate headquarters. It was done. In 7 days, a small, landlocked West African nation had fundamentally and irrevocably altered its destiny. They had called the bluff of an entire global system. They had taken back the key to their own house. But in 7 days, Burkina Faso rewrote history. This act was never just about the glittering metal. It was about what that metal represents: the power to choose one's own path. It is the power to build a hospital where a child can be healed, to pave a road where a farmer can take his goods to market, to fund a university where the next generation of doctors, engineers, and leaders can be trained. It is the tangible conversion of subterranean wealth into human potential. The sight of Ibrahim Traoré walking confidently through a gold mine, the workers not bowing in servitude but saluting in partnership, is the symbol of this new contract. The innocent laughter of Burkinabe children playing in the street is the sound of a future that is now theirs to build. The applause from fellow African leaders is the recognition that this victory is a shared one, a blueprint for a new era of continental cooperation and strength. The image of liquid gold flowing not into the cargo hold of a plane bound for Europe, but into the heart of a national treasury, is the ultimate symbol of wealth returning home to nourish its roots. This is Inside Africa, where freedom is measured in gold. Because in a world that has for so long equated blackness with poverty and powerlessness, the reclamation of economic power is the most radical act of all. It is the assertion that our lives, our nations, and our futures have a value that we ourselves will define. Freedom is not an abstract concept granted by others. It is a tangible reality built with your own hands, from your own resources. It is the unshakable foundation upon which true sovereignty rests. It is the promise that the wealth of Africa will, at last, serve the people of Africa. And that is a story worth its weight in gold.